him, people of privilege almost always prefer to risk destruction, total destruction, rather than surrender any part of their privileges. Intellectual myopia, often called stupidity, is a reason. There's also the invariable feeling that privilege, however egregious, is a basic right. The sensitivity of the poor to injustice is a small thing as compared with that of the rich. And so it was in the Ancien regime. And when reform from above became impossible, then revolution from below became inevitable. Long before Turgot was dismissed, Smith had taken the lessons of his travels back to Scotland. He was at work on his great book, and his friends had come to wonder if he would ever finish it. Perhaps he was one of that great company of scholars, still very much extant, for whom work on a forthcoming book and conversation about it is a substitute for ever publishing it. Eventually, in 1776, the year of American independence, he published it. The acclaim was immediate, and the first edition of The Wealth of Nations sold out at once. The basic argument was simple, again illustrated by our landscape and its occupants. It was naturally buried in the great mass of information, which as a man of reason Smith brought to his support. The wealth of a nation results from the diligent pursuit by each of its citizens of his own interests. In serving his own interest, each individual will be guided to serve the public interest, as though, said Smith, by an unseen hand. The state need not and should not interfere. The wealth of the nation is the result of the free exercise of effort by each individual. These included the capitalist, whose mills now began to attract workers from the countryside to industry. The factory became the setting then of Smith's second great source of wealth. This was the division of labor. The gains from specialization in the largest sense of that term was for Adam Smith a source of productivity of the greatest importance. Smith described a primordial production line. It was for the making of pins.
One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business, to whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper.
10 men so dividing the labor, Smith calculated, could make 48,000 pins a day. One man by himself would make maybe 1, maybe 20. The capitalists who owned the machines did not altogether inspire Smith's trust, nor did any other businessmen. Here is Smith on merchants.
People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment or diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices.
Devout free enterprisers in our day, who genuflect at the mention of Adam Smith's name, rarely base their sermon on this particular text. Benjamin Franklin was one of Smith's contemporaries, and maybe he was the source of one of Smith's more mordant passages. Here is Smith on slavery.
The late resolution of the Quakers of Pennsylvania to set at liberty their Negro slaves may satisfy us that their number cannot be very great.
Smith had very little faith that righteousness could triumph over self-interest, but he was wholly content with the motivating power of self-interest. In the very year of the Wealth of Nations, the American colonies, in which Smith had a great interest, were lost. Many Englishmen thought the sugar islands of the West Indies more valuable, and these, of course, remained. Still, Smith would have kept the mainland colonies, accorded them full representation in Parliament, faced when it came the day when the population of the Americas would be greater than that of Britain. When that day came, the capital would be moved across the Atlantic. Indianapolis, say, would be the new Westminster. Britain's trade did expand wonderfully. Smith deplored the dead hand of feudalism, its manners, symbols, and constraints. However, to the London merchants who flourished under his system, the old style was thought, as always, to add respectability and distinction to the new wealth. In a budget speech, Pitt was to say of Adam Smith that his extensive knowledge of detail and depth of philosophical research will, I believe, furnish the best solution of every question connected with the history of commerce and with the system of political economy. An economist could ask no more than that. Adam Smith died in 1790 in Edinburgh. The great prophet of free trade had been made commissioner of customs there, a sinecure, but he was much too practical to refuse. Smith lies here in a small burial ground just off the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. Scholars come to visit, but not very many. Economists, I would judge, are rather negligent of their heroes. By the time Smith died, the changes which his ideas foretold, the changes of which he was the prophet, were becoming evident in Scotland as well as in England, and in both the countryside and the towns. The Industrial Revolution was not a sudden, violent thing, but it was a revolution that people could actually see. From the countryside, as I said, people were being drawn to the new factories, and they were also being expelled by the rising demand for one of the great industrial materials of the time, wool. The most spectacular expulsion was here in Scotland, in Sutherland in the far north. In the 15 years after 1807, the Duchess of Sutherland and her husband, Lord Stafford, threw out between 5,000 and 10,000 inhabitants to make room for sheep. They had the right. They owned 2/3 of the county, the largest in Scotland. Perhaps the demand for wool and the resulting higher rents was not the only reason for the expulsion. It was said at the time that the Cheviots moving over the hills were far more beautiful than the Highlanders. This could have been so. In 1814, on the narrow strip of arable land that borders the Strathnaver, the clearances had some of the aspects of what would one day be called a final solution. The agents of the laird moved in with fire and dogs, and the roof timbers were burned as a special precaution. Because the highlands being treeless, the houses could not then be rebuilt. On one or two occasions, it seems, the houses were burned without bothering to remove the more aged inhabitants. The clearances were cruel, but they brilliantly illustrated a problem in economic development that persists unsolved to the present time. It is possible to have such a bad relationship between people and land, so many people and so little usable land, that development is really impossible. There can be no change if the people are to live. That was true here, and it remains the problem in India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and other densely populated countries. The Highland technique that was used here for reducing population is no longer recommended. Birth control lends itself very well to speeches, but only very slowly, when at all, to results. There's no more land to be had. This is a problem, obviously, to which I'm going to have to return. Where could these people go? The expanding factories were the obvious answer, but they didn't